Okay, so welcome everybody. This is like the second colloquium of this year's series. And I'm very happy to welcome Ivan Schneider to our virtual astrophysics colloquium this Wednesday. And a few words about our speaker. Ivan graduated from the University of Arizona in Tucson in 2017. And soon after her graduation, she moved to the Garden State in New Jersey, where she conducted independent research as a NASA Hubble Fellow and a Lyman Spitzer Fellow at the Department of Astrophysical Sciences of Princeton University, where I also met her. And in 2020, she joined the faculty of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Pittsburgh University as an assistant professor. So Ivan is interested in the study of galaxy formation and evolution with an emphasis on computational techniques. And she has actually developed her own hydrodynamics code, which is known as CHOLLA, if I pronounce it correctly, and has secured also computational time in some of the largest computing clusters in the US. She's also very interested in diversity and equity in science, and she has played an active role in the departmental life by participating in several relevant committees. So in addition to that, Ivan has also been involved in outreach activities. For instance, she was a speaker of the Astronomy on Tap in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Austin. But also, which is a very cool thing that she did, she has been an instructor at the Princeton Teaching Initiative. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Ivan. And today she will be talking to us about the origin of multiphase galaxy outflows. And we are very interested in listening to what she's going to say about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to speak. Obviously, it would be nice to get to visit the university in person sometime, but as we were chatting about before, it's nice to be able to give talks all around the world, so it's nice to get to chat with you all today. So I'm gonna talk today mostly about the research that I've been working on in the last couple of years on galaxy outflows, and this is work that I was doing primarily with collaborators at Princeton and Santa Cruz and Ohio State. But I also, throughout the talk, will be featuring work by students, and so definitely watch for their names as we go through. I've had the privilege of working with some really talented students over the last few years. So let's get started. So there are a lot of ways, I think, to motivate why galaxy outflows are interesting. I sort of like to start the story from what I consider the beginning, in the sense that galaxy outflows have been known for I guess about 50 years now, 50 or 60 years. And this was a paper, I think, that made the first compelling case for a galaxy outflow. So this was a paper by Lenz and Sandage in 1963. The title of the paper was Evidence for an Explosion in the Center of the Galaxy M82. So M82 had been known as an irregular galaxy, and it also had been known that it had these H-alpha filaments that extended above and below the disk along the minor axis of the galaxy in the center. You can see those a little bit more clearly in this differenced image that also shows up in this 1963 paper, where they isolated the H-alpha emission, and you can see these filaments really clearly. And the sort of compelling evidence that was presented in this paper for the first time was they did spectroscopy on these H-alpha filaments and were able to determine the velocities of the gas. And this statement from the abstract reads, the filaments on both sides of the plane appear to be expanding from the center along the minor axis with velocities ranging up to about 1,000 kilometers a second. And so this, I think, is the first, as I said, compelling evidence of what we now would call a galaxy outflow. So gas that is moving away from the galaxy often at high speed. And the point that was made in this paper was that it must require an immense amount of energy to accelerate gas to these velocities in these quantities. And so I would say, for the next 60 or 70 years, we as astronomers and theorists have been trying to understand more about this process. This is now a modern image of the same galaxy. This is made with a composite of 3 different space telescopes. And what I like about this image is that it sort of shows you really the multi-phase nature of these outflows. So Chandra, the X-ray telescope, has imaged M82 in both hard and soft X-rays. So the hard X-rays are the sort of pinkish emission you can see at the very center in this image. And that's actually tracing the superheated thermalized gas from the many supernovae that are going off in the center of this galaxy. So M82 we now know is what we call a starburst galaxy. It's undergone an episode of rapid star formation at the nuclear region over the last 10 to 50 million years. And as a result, there is this extremely hot gas at the very center that is expanding outward along the minor axis primarily, and blowing this, this wind, if you will. And then you can also see in the blue, this is the soft X-rays. So this traces more like million Kelvin gas, and that expands outward in this sort of biconical structure. So M82 is a sort of canonical example of what we call a bipolar outflow. But this image also has data from Hubble. So the green is tracing the sort of optical light, and the yellow is tracing the H alpha. So you can see the H alpha filaments that extend out in the outflow. And Spitzer, which is an infrared telescope. So it's tracing the dust, that's the red. And you can see that, all of these different temperatures are present in this outflow, implying that there's really gas at a wide range of phases, and it all is interacting in this wind. So we'd like to understand this system better, but obviously it's quite complicated. It turns out if you image in molecular gas, right, you also see molecular gas. And so this wide range of densities and temperatures and velocities means that, from a sort of theoretical standpoint, there's a lot going on here to understand. I think the second thing that is interesting to me about outflows is that it's sort of become common knowledge in the last 20 years or so that outflows are really a critical part of the galaxy formation and evolution process. And what I mean by that is, if you run a cosmological simulation, you try to reproduce the numbers and types of galaxies that we see in the universe, it's become clear that you really have to have feedback from stars driving gas out of galaxies in order to match most, if not all, of the observed properties of galaxies that we see. And a nice example of this is shown in this plot. This is the stellar mass function of galaxies at redshift 0. So the x-axis shows you, sort of the logarithmic mass of galaxies in bins by stellar mass, and the y-axis shows you their volumetric number density. The yellow points are the observed mass function of galaxies at redshift 0, and the blue dashed line shows you, essentially the baryonic content you would expect galaxies of that mass to contain, based on just gravitational infall and what we know about the cosmic baryon fraction. And so you can see both at the high mass and at the low mass end, there's essentially a lot of mass missing. Galaxies just have managed to get rid of a lot of the baryons that they should contain if, just gravitational infall and conversion into stars was the only process going on. I think another compelling piece of evidence for the importance of outflows is the fact that we see metals outside of galaxies, right? So there have been a lot of surveys now of gas and galaxy halos, and often that gas is observed in various metal ionization lines. But metals, of course, are produced inside of galaxies in stars, and so getting them out into the far reaches of the halos and even the IGM, again, requires some process like outflows to just drive that gas out there. I actually came to this field from a sort of more specific and puzzling question that theorists were working on, which is the fact that in the outflows that we do see, we often see very fast moving, relatively cool gas. So by cool in this talk, I mean, 10 to the 4 Kelvin or so, the kind of gas that would be giving rise to that H alpha emission we saw in the M82 image. But when you look at galaxies in what's called a down the barrel observation, so I've got a little schematic at the bottom of the slide that shows you what I mean, where the stellar light in the galaxy provides a background continuum source, and then you can see intervening gas in absorption. If you look at a star-forming galaxy, particularly at higher redshifts, you get absorption lines that look like the ones shown in this plot. So if you focus on the middle panel here, this is the magnesium-2 doublet. And what you can see is relative to the rest velocity of the galaxy, the systemic velocity, which is here at 0, which is the speed of the stars. You get absorption in this magnesium-2 line all the way out to 600, 700 kilometers a second. And that means that there's relatively cool gas that's moving away from the galaxy at very high speeds. And that indicates this sort of cool outflowing material. And similarly, we see a lot of cool gas in the halos of galaxies. So primarily thanks to the COS, the Cosmic Origin Spectrograph on Hubble in the last decade or so, there have been many absorption line surveys of the gas in the halos of galaxies, primarily using quasars as background sources. And what we find is that even in the halos of relatively massive galaxies, where you might expect most of the gas to be heated to million or more Kelvin degrees, just because of the virial shock, we actually see like lots of neutral hydrogen and cooler gas in those halos. So this plot shows, as a function of radius away from the galaxy, the neutral hydrogen absorption for each of these points represents a single galaxy for which there was a quasar absorption system. And so this is, again, a little bit puzzling because we don't necessarily expect there to be cool gas in galaxy halos for Milky Way mass galaxies or higher. So how does it get there? And of course, I've just said there's cool gas moving out of galaxies quickly in outflows. There's cool gas in the halos. So a logical conclusion might be that the gas is sort of continuously replenished and deposited there. But the reason that this was an interesting question to work on is that it turns out that if you just try taking, a cool cloud of gas, which is what's represented in this this simulation, and hitting it with a hot background wind, the kind of wind that's generated by supernova explosions, right? Rather than accelerating the cool gas, what a lot of studies had shown was that you tended to destroy the cloud. Essentially, the destruction time scale of the cool gas as a result of things like Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities is shorter than the acceleration time due to ram pressure, right? Just pushing on the gas to accelerate it. And so it wasn't easy to explain how you could get 600, 700, 800 kilometer a second gas at distances of 8 or 10 kiloparsecs from a galaxy, just by sort of having the interaction of cool gas phases with hot gas phases. And so that, I think, was a sort of theoretical puzzle that got me interested in this question of multi-phase outflows in the first place. So this is, I guess, a sort of broad but motivating question for the work that I'm going to talk about today, which was just, can we build a physically motivated model that explains the observed nature of galaxy outflows, right? We'd like to explain the multi-phase nature. We'd like to explain the velocities that we see, and ideally also be able to explain some of these observations of gas in galaxy halos that are a little bit puzzling. And of course, I'm a simulator, and so the answer is going to be simulations, but it's worth talking a little bit about why this problem hadn't been solved by simulations before. And the answer is that outflows are a challenging problem to simulate in the sense that they're quite computationally demanding. And the reason, as with many things in astronomy, right, is that there's a large dynamic range that needs to be resolved. So, we think that these outflows are driven by supernova explosions, but individual supernova bubbles in the ISM have radii of, a few parsecs. And then, if you care about a sort of global galaxy outflow in a disk, you need to, capture the entire wind generation region, which has scales of, maybe a kiloparsec. Then, we see outflows in these systems like M82 out to like 10 kiloparsecs or more. And of course, if you want to understand what's going on in the halo, you need another factor of 10 in your dynamic range. And our usual techniques for dealing with these large dynamic ranges, things like, Lagrangian methods or adaptive mesh refinement, where you get successively worse resolution as you go out, aren't good for this problem, because in order to resolve the kinds of mixing processes that I was just showing in that simulation of the cloud with the wind, you really need high resolution everywhere. And so this is the problem, is that you can't run a simulation that covers 100 kiloparsecs, but has 1 or 10 parsec resolution. That is just wasn't computationally tractable. And so people had tried various techniques to run parts of this problem, like the cloud wind simulation that I showed, or galaxy-wide simulations with lower resolution. But those techniques weren't sufficient to answer this question. And so this is where the work that I did in my PhD thesis comes in. So I had written a hydrodynamics code that was unique in the sense that it was written to run on new accelerating hardware, graphics processing units. And so graphics processing units are basically just the video cards that come in computers, but they've started to show up in HPC systems because they're very good at doing parallel processing. And so hydrodynamics in a grid-based code is a very parallel problem. And so the thought was we could write a new piece of software that would take advantage of that parallelization and allow us to run faster, bigger problems. And so the code that I wrote is called Cholla. Cholla is a type of cactus that lives in the desert in Arizona. That's where the name came from, but it is an acronym. It stands for Computational Hydrodynamics on Parallel Architectures. And so that was the idea. It was from the beginning, Cholla was designed to be really efficient at running really big, computationally expensive problems. And we've continued to develop it over the years. So it now contains not only hydrodynamics, but also, radiative cooling and heating modules. There's static gravity, which I used for the simulations I'm going to show today. We can track passive scalars. It now also contains all of the physics necessary to do large cosmology problems. So self-gravity based on FFTs. There's a particle evolution scheme and cosmology. Everything I've highlighted in blue here has been the thesis work of Bruno Villaseñor, who's at UCSC. He just put out a paper on the archive this past week showing some of his cosmology simulations, which are really pretty stunning. And we continue to work and develop it. So right now I've got graduate students working on star formation and stellar feedback, working on MHD, working on a dust model, radiative transfer, being able to do open boundaries for FFT gravity problems. And we're also working on adding a testing and continuous integration scheme just to deal with the complications of having an open source code with so many contributors. So if you're interested in running these kinds of problems, this is, as I said, it's an open source code. It's publicly available on GitHub, and we're always welcoming more collaborators. One of the nice things about Cholla is that it is able to run quite efficiently on the world's most powerful supercomputers. So for example, right now at Oak Ridge National Lab, the fastest open science supercomputer in the US is Summit. This is a 200 petaflop machine. It gets all of that computing power basically from the GPUs. So Summit contains 27,600 NVIDIA GPUs that provide all of that processing power. And using this kind of supercomputer, we can run, as I said, lots of expensive hydrodynamic simulations. So this is a visualization of one of the cosmological simulations that Bruno performed And you can see more of these in his paper that was out on the archive this week. But the idea here was just to look at the Lyman alpha forest in absorption. And so Bruna ran a suite of hundreds of 2048 cubed cosmological simulations to understand the sort of photo heating history of the universe. And this is the kind of thing that is only possible with a code that is extremely computationally efficient and the kinds of resources that are available on these supercomputers. So I think it's a really exciting era that we are entering here, in the sense that we're now able to use both these new software tools and this new technology to start to run problems that just really weren't tractable in the last decade or so. And I should mention, actually, Summit is going to very shortly be surpassed. So Oak Ridge is currently installing Frontier, which is supposed to be the first US exascale computer. So it will be capable of more than an exaflop of computations. We've been working with a whole team on getting Cholla ready to run on Frontier when it comes online. And so I think that's going to be a really exciting new frontier, if you will, in the kinds of problems we'll be able to tackle. Okay, but back to galaxy outflows. So I'm going to talk about a series of simulations, a suite of simulations that I ran actually on the precursor to Summit, even the Titan supercomputer. Also on GPUs, and I called this suite the Cholla Galactic Outflow Simulations Project, or CGOLS. And the idea was to try to understand the kinds of outflows we see in, like an M82 type galaxy. So something a little smaller than the Milky Way that's rapidly star forming and driving one of these multi-phase outflows to see if we could answer some of these questions. And so I ran a series of simulations that are detailed in these 3 papers. And the idea in the simulations was to run in a box that was sort of big enough to capture the galaxy scale. So each of the boxes is 10 by 10 by 20 kiloparsecs, but at a resolution that also captures these mixing processes between phases really well. So we ran these at a resolution of 2048 by 2048 by 4096 cells, which means that for our sort of fiducial resolution simulations, the resolution of each cell throughout the computational domain is just under 5 parsecs. So what's unique about this simulation suite is essentially how much computational power we're devoting to a single galaxy, in the sense that if you compare this to where sort of cosmological simulations or Zoom simulations or ISM simulations fall. This is a plot that I made that just shows the sort of number of volume elements. So you can think of that as either cells or particles, depending on the simulation method, and the average resolution in the computational volume, right? Cosmological simulations fall down here in the bottom right, where they've got a lot of cells, but they are not resolving things outside of the central regions of galaxies very well. Whereas cosmological Zoom simulations do a better job of resolving things in and outside of galaxies with far fewer volume elements, but of course are not capturing populations of galaxies. And then this red box, I think, is really interesting, because these are simulations that have comparable resolution to what we have in CGOLS, but they don't have nearly as many cells, and so they basically are just simulating small patches of a galaxy, right? And so we kind of entered this new region of parameter space where we're really devoting, the kinds of computational power that is typically used in cosmological simulations, but we're focusing it all on isolated galaxies. Okay, so now a little bit about the simulations that we ran. All of them have the same setup. So basically we start with a gas disk that has properties sort of reminiscent of M82, but we just set the gas disk at the beginning in hydrostatic equilibrium, so the gas is rotating, and we set a temperature floor of 10 to the 4 Kelvin. So I'm not trying to resolve the multi-phase ISM in these simulations. We're going to be focused on the interaction between this 10 to the 4 K phase and the hot phase in the outflow. All of the simulations have a static gravitational potential that consists of a stellar disk and a dark matter halo. again, properties set to sort of roughly reflect M82 scale of galaxies. So trying to get at, what are these sort of rapidly star-forming galaxies at roughly Z of 1 doing? And we ran all of the simulations at 3 different resolutions so that we can test for convergence in the various properties that we're going to measure. And then the idea is to drive an outflow by simulating feedback, but we do this in a sort of prescribed way. So over the course of this talk, I'm going to show you a few different models that we ran, and the feedback we're going to generate just by injecting mass and energy into the gas in the disk and then watching the outflow as it forms. And so in all of the simulations, we'll either do that energy injection just in a central region, or we'll do it in a sort of more distributed, clustered way. And the things that we're going to vary in the different simulations are what we call the mass loading, the energy loading, and the star formation rate. So I'll explain the mass loading, the energy loading a little bit more on the next couple of slides, but I should note that star formation rate is in quotes here because, again, we're not simulating star formation itself. I'm just associating a given star formation rate, say 20 solar masses per year, with an amount of energy and mass that should be injected based on the number of supernovae we expect, given a star formation rate of 20 solar masses per year. All right, so then what do I mean by mass loading and energy loading? So this goes back to actually one of the earliest analytic models for a galaxy wind. This is the Chevalier and Clegg model from 1985, and it was developed to try to explain the hot wind in M82. And the idea is that it's quite simple. It assumes spherical symmetry, and basically its solution is governed by these 3 parameters. Within a given injection radius R, mass is injected as a source term and energy is injected as a source term. So m dot and e dot are the mass injection rate and the energy injection rate within this radius R. And it doesn't worry about any physics beyond hydrodynamics. So we're neglecting gravity, we're neglecting radiative cooling, we're neglecting any additional sources of momentum, radiation pressure, that kind of thing. But if you do that and then you solve the equations of hydrodynamics in spherical symmetry, oh, sorry, I should just quickly mention this m dot and this m dot e dot are related to these terms, the mass loading factor and the energy loading factor, in the sense that the m dot in the wind itself can be related to the star formation rate by this factor beta, the mass loading factor. So that just tells you how much mass is in the wind relative to the rate of star formation ongoing in the galaxy. And similarly, the energy in the wind can be related to the star formation rate by doing this conversion between how many stars are forming, how many supernovae do you expect given that star formation rate. If each supernova provides 10 to the 51 ergs of energy, then that gives you a total energy injection rate relative to the star formation rate. And you can compare that to the energy in the wind, and that gives you the energy loading factor. So alpha has to be less than 1 in the sense that you can't have more energy in the wind than was provided in the star formation. But beta can be higher than 1 because you can add mass to the wind from the ISM beyond what the star formation rate predicts. All right, so what's nice about the Chevalier and Clegg model is, as I said, it has an analytic solution. So this is a plot showing as a function of radius, various physical parameters we might care about, like the density, the pressure, and the velocity. What you can see is, so I've normalized the radii here to that injection radius. So you can see that at the injection radius, these solutions go through a supersonic transition. So the Mach number goes up above 1, and I should say this is a log scale on the y-axis. The velocities asymptote to some value that's just going to be a function of the energy to mass injection rate, and then the density falls off, as 1 over r squared, and the pressure falls off slightly faster than that. So this is nice because it means you should be able to predict properties of the hot wind based on just what the mass and energy injected in the wind in the star forming region is. So the first simulation we ran was actually basically a test of the Chevalier and Clegg model, but in a disk. So this is what this simulation looks like. Basically, on the left, I'm showing a density projection. On the right, I'm showing a temperature projection. We just start injecting mass and energy into our disk region based on some m dot and e dot rate. And then you can see that just drives an outflow out of the disk. And it looks pretty smooth at early times, but at later times, you start to see, there's a lot more turbulence going on in the outflow region as this injection region, the hot gas from that region, is interacting with the gas in the disk. You'll also see in just a couple seconds here, I changed the M dot and E dot rates, the mass loading and energy rates in the middle of the simulation, and that changes the overall properties of the outflow in the sense that I lower the mass loading relative to the energy loading. That gives a hotter, faster outflow than we saw at earlier times. And I should say this simulation was done without the effects of radiative cooling because we wanted to start by just comparing to the simplest analytic model that we had. And it turns out when you compare to the analytic model, basically there are two regions in this outflow solution. There's the region within what I'll call the outflow cone. So on the left here is a density slice through that simulation at 25 million years. Within the outflow cone, the analytic model provides a very good fit to the simulation results. So this is what I would call the free wind region. And you can see if I plot the number density here as a function of radius, this is in white, the solid line is the analytic solution that you would expect from the Chevalier and Clegg model based on the M dot and E dot and R that we chose. And the dashed blue line is the average value from all of the cells within the injection, within this cone, and it provides essentially an exact match. So if you're in the injection, in the sort of free wind cone, then the analytic model provides a very good fit to the solution. That's true for all of the physical variables that we measure. You can see the pressure and temperature also follow exactly the Chevalier and Clegg solution. The velocity that we measure in our simulation is slightly lower than the asymptotic velocity predicted by the analytic model, but that's because we included gravity and the Chevalier and Clegg model doesn't. So that gravity doesn't have a strong effect on the hot gas, but it has a slight effect. More interestingly, though, I think, is what happens outside of that sort of free wind cone, where actually the Chevalier and Clegg model doesn't provide a good fit to the data. There is, as I said, this sort of turbulent interaction between the hot wind and the cool gas in the disk, and that gives rise to a lot of intermediate temperature, intermediate density gas. And so if I do now a plot in projection of the predicted soft X-ray emission, that's what I'm showing here on the left. And this is just, a super simple estimate of the X-ray emission based on, essentially the cooling rate of the gas in relevant density and temperature bins. If I bin this up in, in Z, so in height above the disk, and plot it, that's what I'm showing on the right. So as a function of height above the disk, the blue line here shows basically the surface density of the X-ray, soft X-ray emission. The yellow line shows the exponential fit to the soft X-ray emission for the M82 system. And what we see is that they're actually like a pretty good match. Certainly they're the same order of magnitude, and the total X-ray luminosity that we get in the simulation is within a factor of 2, basically, of the total observed X-ray luminosity. The reason this is interesting is this was the first model, to our knowledge, to even come within an order of magnitude of the observed X-ray emission in M82. And I think the reason comes down to the fact that a lot of this soft X-ray emission is being generated by this interface between the very hot gas and the cool gas in the disk. That creates a lot of intermediate density, intermediate temperature gas that gives rise to the soft X-rays. And without high resolution, you just can't see it. So this is nice because, whereas the analytic model, say the Chevalier and Clegg model, predicts much too fast a drop off as a function of height in the soft X-rays, this model actually provides a much better fit to the observed data, both for M82 and for other systems where this X-ray emission above the plane has been measured. All right, but that model's not particularly realistic for a couple of reasons, one of which is that we've completely neglected radiative cooling, right? And so we think actually radiative cooling is probably very important in these kinds of winds. And one of the models that actually got me thinking about doing a project in this way was the one that was put forth by Todd Thompson in a paper in 2016, which is basically the Chevalier and Clegg model, but with radiative cooling. And the idea there is, you assume, as in the Chevalier and Clegg model, you have some wind generating region in the disk that's powered by supernova explosions. And then maybe you are driving some cool clouds out, but that those clouds are getting sort of rapidly shredded and their density is getting added into the hot phase. Okay, this is consistent with what we had seen in these, small cloud wind simulations. That should create a hot, fast wind that is mass loaded in the sense that its density is higher than what you would predict just from supernovae ejecta. And if its density is high enough, it can actually undergo rapid radiative cooling and cool down to 10 to the 4 Kelvin. So Todd did some sort of back of the envelope calculations for where this cooling radius should be. And it turns out that if you estimate, say, a cooling time for gas in the hot wind, which is going to be a function of the energy injection rate, alpha, right, the energy loading, to the mass injection rate, the mass loading beta. And then you also calculate an advection time. How long does it take for the hot wind to get from the generation region out, which is also going to be a function of the mass loading to the energy loading. If you set that cooling time equal to the advection time, you can solve for this cooling radius as a function of the energy to mass injection. And what Todd found was with sort of reasonable numbers of alpha and beta, we'll talk about what reasonable means later, you could get cooling radii that were of order a few kiloparsecs, right? And the thought was, well, maybe this is a way to generate fast moving cool gas, this basically by just cooling it out of the hot phase by increasing the density in the hot phase enough. And so we tested this model essentially directly. So this is going to be the exact same simulation that I ran before, but now with radiative cooling turned on, which is effectively a test of the Thompson 2016 model. So same idea. I'm just going to start injecting mass and energy in the center, but now I've turned on radiative cooling. And what you'll see, right, is that now this purple color represents the 10 to the 4 Kelvin gas. It proceeds exactly as Todd predicted. You get a cooling radius at a few kiloparsecs. What happened just then, I changed the mass loading to the energy loading. So I decreased the mass loading relative to the energy loading, and the cooling radius moved out until it was no longer in the simulation domain. So essentially, the reason that we picked the mass loading and energy loading values that we did was so that we could test a time when the cooling radius would be in the simulation domain versus a time when the energy loading to the mass loading was too high for there to be this rapid cooling. And that's exactly what we saw. And so indeed, this model basically matched what Todd had predicted analytically really well. These are just temperature slices through the domain at 4 sort of characteristic times. You can see at early times, this shock is moving out into the halo gas, exactly as the sort of analytic wind bubble prediction demonstrates. At 25 million years here, where the mass loading relative to the energy loading is high, you see this cooling radius. The white dashed line shows the analytic prediction for where it should be. So you can see it matches really well. At later times, when I've just decreased the mass loading and the energy loading is still high, that cooling radius moves out. And then at the end of the simulation, right, you just have a cool disk and a hot outflow. But one of the things you'll note, right, is that in this simulation, the late time flow is very smooth. You don't see all of that interesting turbulent structure coming from the interaction of the hot gas with the cool disk. And that's because at this interface now, all of that energy that was previously giving rise to turbulence is just being sapped away by the radiative cooling. So this actually, in many ways, looks less like a multi-phase outflow than the simulation that we did before without radiative cooling. I can make similar plots of the various physical variables as a function of radius, so density, velocity, pressure, and temperature. And what we see is indeed, as I said, they match the analytic model quite well, right? So now I'm showing both the Chevalier and Clegg model in a solid line and Todd's model in a dashed white line. And you can see that our simulation data, which is in the colored lines, matches Todd's dashed line really well. This is actually, I think, a better match than we might have even expected, because Todd's model, used a power law fit to the cooling curve, made some sort of more stringent assumptions than our simulations, and nevertheless, the data matches the predictions quite well. although you can see in the temperature, we have a temperature floor, right? So where did we stand though at this point, having run these two models? Basically, we had this adiabatic model that did a really good job reproducing the soft X-ray observations, but it doesn't tell us anything about fast-moving cool gas. And then we had this radiative model that produced fast-moving cool gas, but it really didn't have a multi-phase structure, right? So the problem with both of these models is that neither of them can account for multi-phase structure at a given radius in an outflow, which is what we see. So the next sort of phase of this project was, now that we have a sort of solid baseline understanding of the analytic models, how can we break some of the assumptions we've been making in order to produce a model that's more realistic? And so the assumptions we've been making at this point, right, are basically, we've been assuming the radius within which we're going to deposit the feedback. We've been assuming that the feedback is going to be spherically symmetric. And then we've been assuming values for the mass and energy loading. And those values, while not sort of, unreasonable, are completely arbitrary in the simulations I've been showing. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to show a simulation where we broke those assumptions. But first, I just want to mention, why did we make the choices that we made? And so the answer has to do with some facts about star formation. Basically, we know stars form in clusters, right? And we know that bigger stars form in bigger clusters, right? So if we look at the spiral arm here in M83, a star-forming galaxy, you can see these ionized H2 regions, and they tend to be, sites where massive stars are forming. And so the massive stars that are going to be responsible for the supernovae that are going to drive these outflows tend to form in big clusters. And so a thought was, rather than having a single injection region or trying to scatter supernovae, sort of one-off throughout the disk, probably if we want to make a realistic outflow model, we should be injecting this mass and energy in clusters, right, that represent clustered star formation, because that's how star formation proceeds in galaxies. And then the question is, how many star clusters do we need? And for this, we took advantage of the fact that the cluster mass function itself is pretty shallow, by which I mean that most of the stellar mass that forms is in the biggest clusters. In fact, this PDF goes basically as x to the -1, which is to say that if you pick any given mass, like 10 to the 6 here, this is the cumulative cluster mass distribution for M82, half of the mass is in the 3 largest clusters here, right? And so what that means, if you want to simulate a galaxy like M82, is that you can probably get away, if you're interested in the outflow properties, with only simulating a few of the largest clusters, because they are responsible for injecting most of the mass and the energy. So that's basically what we decided to do, but that still doesn't tell us how much mass and energy to inject for a given cluster, right? And so to answer that question, I basically ran a series of smaller simulations. I call these super bubble simulations. The idea is, in a well-resolved ISM model, so an actual multi-phase ISM where we have both cool gas and cold gas, right? Set off a bunch of supernovae and then measure the mass and energy injection rate that's associated with the supernova rate for a given cluster. So this is what one of these simulations looks like. On the left is a temperature projection through one of these sort of multi-phase ISM boxes, and on the right is a temperature slice. And basically, I can set off supernovae at a rate that is consistent with whatever I assumed the mass of the cluster, and just watch this bubble as it expands out in this ISM box, right? So you can see the temperature here on the right. You have clouds of sort of 100 Kelvin gas, and then the background sort of warm ionized medium is more like 10 to the 4K, and the super bubble itself is generating this hot shocked gas, which is consistent with our sort of 3-phase model of the ISM. And so I ran a series of these simulations for different cluster masses and different average densities, ISM densities. And then basically the idea, right, was just to measure the mass and injection rate at a given radius that will be consistent with the radius of the clusters that I want in my global galaxy simulations, right? So this is just another example. If I look at the density slice here on the left, and I draw a sphere in this box, I can measure the mass flux through that sphere. That's what I'm plotting on the right. So as a function of time for this cluster, what is m dot through that sphere? And that mass injection rate is the rate that I will use in my global galaxy simulation for a cluster, right? So now I have a measurement of what m dot and e dot should be for a given star cluster of a given mass in a given average density ISM. And so I can use that to run a global simulation where I don't resolve the multi-phase ISM, and I just have clusters that I place arbitrarily, but I know what m dot and e dot should be. So that's the next simulation that we ran. Now I'm showing, again, a density projection and a temperature projection, but in a sort of rotating box so you can see their asymmetries. And I inject mass and energy in these little clusters now, instead of just in a central region. And what that does, as you can see, is produces an outflow that looks really different from the outflows that we've seen before. And in particular, it produces a multi-phase outflow. So you can see all of these little filaments are essentially at 10 to the 4 Kelvin. So these are cool gas, and they are embedded in this background hot phase, right? So you can see both in the density and in the temperature projections here, they're basically clumps of cool gas that are moving out in this background lower density, more tenuous hot phase. And I got really excited when I saw this because this looks a lot more like, you know, the multi-phase outflows that I showed you images of at the start of this talk. We also got better at rendering between the first set of simulations I showed and this one. So this is an example of actually just a rendering of the density field from that simulation. Something that I like about this is that the way that we've colored it, you can actually see there's kind of two different types of filamentary cloud structure here. If you look close to the center, which is, you know, as we're, you know, zooming in here, it'll be a little harder to see, but as it rotates back up, I want you to look kind of close to the center. You can see these little sort of peach colored blobs. Those are higher density clouds that are essentially just ISM blobs that have been pushed out of the disk. But you can see those actually don't extend very far out from the central region where these clusters are going off. Outside of that region, you get this more tenuous, so lower density sort of clouds. And those lower density clouds are not, you know, just clumps of ISM gas that have been pushed out. They're all gas that's been sort of mixed together. So hot phase gas that's been mixed with ISM gas. And I think this really kind of describes the two sorts of clouds that we see in these simulations. Close to disk, they're sort of slow moving, very dense clumps of gas that have essentially just been pushed out of the disk without undergoing, you know, too much mixing. But further out, it's all gas that has been mixed. And as I'll show in the next couple plots, the momentum in the cool phase as we move out with radius has been transferred to it from the hotter phase. So I said this looks more like a multi-phase outflow. This plot just sort of demonstrates that. If you look on the left, this is, again, a density projection through the simulation at a certain time. And I've excised the disk region here. So the plot on the right doesn't include anything in this, you know, central, you know, below a height of 1 kiloparsec. So then this plot on the right is just a histogram of the density versus the temperature, where the bins are colored by the mass in each bin. And what you can see is this really is a multi-phase outflow in the sense that there's gas at all of these different phases, but it's primarily two-phase in the sense that most of the mass is either in this, you know, hot phase, sort of between 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 7 Kelvin, that's low density, or in this cool phase down near 10 to the 4 Kelvin, that's higher density. So we do populate the intermediate phases as mass is transferring between these two, but it's primarily a two-phase outflow. We can now make, you know, the same sorts of radial profiles that we made for the other simulations, but I'll divide it up into the hot gas and the cool gas, since, as I said, this is sort of primarily two-phase. So this is what the radial profile for the hot gas looks like for the number density. And what I want you to take away here, the blue is tracing the gas from the simulation, is that it's a much flatter profile as a function of radius than what you would get from the sort of analytic models like the Chevalier and Clegg model or the Thomson model, both of which predict, you know, an r to the -2 drop off in the number density. You can see here we get higher number densities in the hot phase. And I think that's a combination of the fact that we're transferring mass from the cool phase into the hot phase at all radii, and also that we're slowing the hot phase down by shocking it against the cool clouds in the outflow, and that also increases its density. I can make other radial profiles, right? So the radial velocity of the hot phase, you can see, is actually pretty constant outside of a radius of 1 kiloparsec or so. The pressure is dropping off, but also it's flatter than you would predict in either of the analytic models that I discussed. And the temperature is also flatter than the analytic models. So one of the things that we're doing now is coming up with new analytic models for the hot phase that can account for these flatter profiles as a result of the mass transfer and the shocking from these cool clouds. The cool gas radial profiles, I got really excited when I saw, because if you look in particular here at the velocity on the upper right, the velocity of the cool gas is increasing with radius, exactly as we see in the observations. So in sort of spatially resolved observations of systems like M82, we see that the cool gas velocity increases as a function of height above the disk. And here you can see that in our simulation, by the time you get to 10 kiloparsecs or so, we're getting cool gas velocities of 500, 600, 700 kilometers a second. And this is the kind of velocity that we see in those down the barrel observations. And to my knowledge, this was the first time that this had been seen in a simulation. And that's partly because simulations that went out to 10 kiloparsecs didn't have the resolution to capture this multi-phase outflow, and partly because we have high enough resolution to see the mixing between the phases that actually is responsible for transferring the momentum to the cool phase. Okay, I just said most of what I wanted to say about the velocities, so I'll just skip this slide. So then the last thing I kind of want to talk about in the last couple minutes here is, this was all really exciting. We have cool gas now that's moving at high velocities at, radii of 5 to 10 kiloparsecs above the disk. So great, we can sort of reproduce the observations, but how does that cool gas actually form, right? As I said, the sort of cloud wind simulations indicate that you really can't just push on cool gas with hot gas and accelerate it to those speeds without destroying it. So how is it that in our simulation we have cool gas at large radii moving at high speeds? And the answer actually has to do with mixing between the phases. So now I'm going to show a movie of the density slice, a temperature slice, and then this final on the right, this slice is what we call the color variable. And the color variable is just a passively advected scalar field that measures what fraction of the gas in a cell was from, say, an injected cluster versus was ISM gas. So if you watch throughout this movie, the blue represents gas that was originally on the grid. So all of the ISM gas, for example, in the disk is blue, and the yellow represents gas that's injected in a cluster. So like the hot phase that's injected in these clusters. And what you can see is that if you compare between the density and the temperature and the color in these movies, the density and the temperature are clearly correlated, right? The lower temperature gas is higher density, as we would expect for a medium that's basically in pressure equilibrium. But the color shows a lot of mixing, right? So in the outflow, most of the gas is a sort of intermediate purple color. And what that means is that most of the gas in the outflow has been mixed. So if you look in the temperature slice at some of these cool blobs, right, they don't necessarily show up super obviously in the color slice, because the cool gas at large radii is actually a combination of cool gas that was blown out of the ISM and hot gas that was mixed into those clouds. And this is just a snapshot that's basically showing that effect, right? If we look at a specific time where there's a lot of cool gas in the outflow, you can see sort of in the upper right in this temperature slice in the center, that doesn't necessarily show up as obvious blobs in the color slice, because a lot of that cool gas is just mixed in from the hot phase. Okay, and I'll just, this is the last slide that I'll show, because I know I'm running a little short on time, but I just want to point out that this mixing actually predicts the acceleration that we see in the cool gas. So if you assume that all of the momentum in the cool phase was transferred to it by mixing in hot gas that had high speeds, you get a linear correlation between the color and the radial velocity. So that's what I'm showing on the left here is, for all of the cool gas in the outflow, the color as a function of the radial velocity. And this white line shows the analytic prediction from mixing. And the colored histogram shows where the cool gas falls in the simulation. And you can see indeed, like it's basically a linear correlation between color and radial velocity, which implies that ram pressure is effectively not important at all in this interaction. It's all mixing. So the momentum is transferred to the cool phase from the hot phase by mixing. And that, I think, is why we were able to see this effect and other simulations weren't, because you really do need high resolution throughout your simulation volume in order to capture that mixing process. All right, so I'll just put up my little summary here. Basically, what were we able to accomplish then over the course of this project? Were we able to say anything about this model that we wanted to explain the observed nature of outflows? And I think that this model does a really nice job in the sense that indeed we get multi-phase outflows from this sort of clustered supernova feedback in an ISM. We are able to get the velocity structure in the sense that we do have a background hot, fast moving phase, but we also see accelerating cool gas as a function of radius due to this mixing process. And something I didn't really mention, but that is also true of this model, is that the hot phase is also the most metal enriched. And the hot phase tends to be moving the fastest, right? The less mixing, the faster it's going. So this model is also really efficient at transporting metals out of galaxies, because the more metal enriched the gas, the faster it's moving and the further out it will get. All right, so I had a few more slides, but because we are basically out of time, I'll just skip to my final simulation snapshot here and just say, we've actually run additional simulations where we have clusters throughout the gas disk, sort of a distributed feedback model, and we're still analyzing those, but we see sort of qualitatively the same picture of these multi-phase outflows driven by clustered supernova, but quantitatively the picture does seem to depend on the sort of model distribution. So that's something to look out for. And I'll just leave you with this density rendering of our distributed cluster simulation. All right, so that's what I have. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It was a very interesting and clear talk, I have to say. And I think there are going to be questions. So I encourage everybody either to raise their hands or unmute themselves and ask the question directly. Let's see. I see, yes, one raised hand. Yes, please go ahead, Apostole.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Ivan, for your very interesting talk. Quite informative. I have only one question that it's maybe a classical question in this case. When you have so many supernovae, you expect to have also non-thermal particles, which are flowing out with the hot and gas. Therefore, do you take this into account, or are they totally out of question in the sense that they just a small part of the total budget? And for example, these objects should have radio observation, so you can have some idea of electrons that are in the wind or which come from the supernova. Therefore, I was just curious, is it something that people don't take into account because of it's not important, or it is important, but you have to take it separately into account? That makes it more complicated.
Absolutely, it's a great question. So I think, right, I mean, that sort of next frontier in this field of, understanding galaxy outflows is understanding all of the non-thermal processes. And so, right, as you say, electrons people are studying, synchrotron radiation and that sort of thing, but also, cosmic rays are something that some people are really interested in, whether or not you could sort of add momentum to outflows via cosmic rays that, of course, are also produced in these supernova explosions. I think that something that is interesting is that it depends a little bit on the sort of parameters of the galaxy, in the sense that for a given star formation rate and a given galactic potential and a given surface density, you might expect more non-thermal effects to be important. And one of the reasons we chose the specific galaxy that we chose, so a sort of M82-like system, which is maybe 10 times smaller than the Milky Way with 10 times higher star formation rate, is that that's the sort of sweet spot, we think, where the thermal effects are the most important. So we think we're probably really capturing the most important first order physics for an outflow like the kind that we see in M82, which we think is pretty representative of the average star forming galaxy at redshift 1 or 2. But when you get to, both higher, larger systems, so like Milky Way mass and above, and for, sort of like smaller systems like dwarf galaxies, we might expect some of the other non-thermal effects to be increasingly important, relatively speaking, right? And there are different reasons for those on different ends. At the high mass end, if you look at a galaxy like our Milky Way, or even more massive, basically all of the supernova energy tends to cool away in the ISM. So the supernovae are too distributed, and the gas densities are higher relative to the star formation rate itself. And so we think that then some of these non-thermal effects are going to be more important, because the energy from the supernovae is all getting lost via cooling in the ISM, right? On the low mass end, right, different effects are present that are more important because of the very shallow gravitational potentials. So yeah, it's a great question. I think people are working on it. These simulations didn't include any effects outside of the, just the standard hydrodynamic effects from the supernovae, but it's it's definitely an area that the field is really interested in.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Also, if you cannot unmute yourself, or you cannot speak for any reason, you can type your question in the chat. Till I see any raised hand, I will ask one question, which is probably obvious, but so even you mentioned at the beginning that you computed this X-ray surface brightness profile for this very simple adiabatic simulation that you did. And now that you have this more realistic simulation that matches perhaps better the morphology of the multiphase outflows in the M82, how does the X-ray surface brightness profile compare to the observed one? I was wondering.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you've hit on a subtlety that I usually sort of avoid. The short answer is that actually this more realistic simulation, the soft X-ray surface brightness profile, as we computed it with our super simple method, matches slightly less well. So the total X-ray luminosity that we get out is still pretty good. It's like within a factor of 3. But we actually are getting something that's a little bit more peaked. And so this is more reminiscent of the problems with the analytic models in matching the X-ray surface brightness, that they tend to be too highly peaked and then fall off too steeply. And so it is actually the case that the X-ray surface brightness profile for the real multiphase outflow is a little bit more peaked, which indicates, I think, that we're actually still not quite capturing enough high density, sort of intermediate temperature gas at higher radii. And so, there's, I think, a number of effects that could be contributing to that, including how simple our model for calculating the X-ray surface brightness is. But I think it also indicates that, yeah, we still have a little bit of work to do in sort of quantitatively getting this picture exactly right, which makes sense. I mean, this is still a very simple model, but but yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a pretty sensitive probe actually of whether
Yes,
or not
this is
the
very
outflows
important. Mhm.
is good. Yeah, exactly.
I have one more question, but I will keep it for later. I see another hand raised by George.
Yeah, hi. So thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. Just a follow-up on one Maria asked about the X-rays, because I know that in this galaxy there are a lot of point sources, bright ones, and the super Eddington rate, and there are point sources that go up to 10 to the 41 X, which are higher than the whole diffuse emission that you try to model. So I guess that it's more like a comment or question, if you know, have all this been able to be removed on the data that you compare? I guess these are all Chandra data that you are using to compare the total luminosity.
Yeah.
But I'm not
exactly,
sure if there
right.
is also a non-resolved population that you could not sort of like resolved and remove, so that might explain some discrepancy on the results.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Also, like a subtle point that I didn't mention at all. But yeah, so the data that we compare to, which again, I'm not even comparing directly to the data, right? I just showed in this plot the yellow line is the exponential fit to the Chandra data. That data is computed only for systems like M82, where you can do a good job of removing the point sources. Right, so you can actually only make this measurement for, a handful of galaxies, maybe a dozen, because they have to be close enough to do the removal of the point sources, which means that the point sources have to be, spatially resolved relative to the emission above the disk. And so one of the things I would like to do is actually do this comparison, directly with the Chandra data instead of with the exponential fit, and do it for some of the other systems that this measurement has been made for. But indeed, I mean, because you need to remove the point sources, this measurement has only been made for, right, like, a 10 galaxies or something like that, because they have to be nearby and they have to be star forming enough for there to be bright enough diffuse emission above the disk to capture it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And are there any other questions? So I have one more, which was related mostly to the things that you mentioned at the introduction. And as a non-expert, I will ask the question. Probably it's again a naive question. But you mentioned at the beginning that for some of the very massive galaxies, if you go further away and you look at the halos, you can see some cold gas that resides there and that shouldn't be there. And one possibility, as you mentioned, is that this is somehow related to the galactic outflows. And motivated by the things that you showed us with these last simulations, where you see this mixing, very strong mixing in the outflow. How can this outflow transfer very far away cold material, or do you have any idea about this, or how this is connected to the results that you have showed us today?
Yeah, so that's also an excellent question. And the answer is that it appears to be extremely complicated. So there's a few interesting hints from the observations. So one is that we do see differences in the cold gas that is observed in the halos around star-forming galaxies versus around passive galaxies, right? Mm-hmm. Which does indicate that, like, maybe star formation and outflows play a role. I would say that the kinds of outflows I've been showing today are probably mostly responsible for changing the cool gas content in what I would call the inner halo. So say, within 50 kiloparsecs or something. And the field as a whole is sort of coming to a consensus that outside of that, in the outer halo, the cool gas probably needs to be generated via some other mechanism, not outflows. So either, infalling satellites or some thermal instability mechanism. And that's also relevant because we do see cool gas in the halos of passive galaxies. So it looks a little different than the cool gas that we see in the halos of star-forming galaxies.
Mhm.
We do see it there. So you need some mechanism that isn't just, generating it by outflows. And so I think, yeah, I mean, the thing that is interesting about this model is that up until this point, we really didn't have a model period that could get cool gas into the halo via outflows.
Yes.
And it does seem like that is a plausible thing to do in certain systems. I think you have to have pretty high star formation rates for that to work.
Mhm.
But if you have high star formation rates, which at high redshift is no problem, you can seed cool gas in the halo via outflows. But it certainly is not the whole answer, right? So it's probably really important for things like getting metals out.
Yeah.
But it's not the whole answer to where does cool gas and galaxy halos come from. Yeah, that's another great question.
I see. Thank you very much. If I don't see any other raised hands, so if there are no other questions, maybe we should say thanks to our speaker for giving this very interesting talk. And hopefully you will be able to visit us sometime in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, thank you all again.
Okay, I see some virtual clapping hands. So
yeah,
okay.
Right. So
Thank you.
We're all used to the virtual claps.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day. Okay, and see you,
All right, you too.
all of you, in 1 week from now for our next colloquium. Bye.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.